Welcome back to episode number 3 of Tending to Talks. Today we have the remarkable pleasure of welcoming Dawn Prince-Hughes, an accomplished writer, anthropologist, and primatologist. Dawn's best known for her groundbreaking work in exploring the intersection of autism, animal behavior, and human society. She's the author of Songs of the Gorilla Nations, My Journey Through Autism, a captivating memoir that offers unique perspective on her life on the spectrum and her deep connection to the gorillas. Her work fosters a greater understanding of not only the complexities of animal emotions, but also, if not mostly, social dynamics. Dawn, it's an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Thank you for having me.
There are numerous topics I'd love to delve into with you, including the intersection of education and autism, as well as dispelling some common misconceptions about being on the spectrum. It seems important, as you have done for your literary and academic work, to initiate this dialogue between what we like to classify as neurodivergent and neurotypical for, I believe, evolutionary sake, for the sake of growing into a more open, understanding, and ultimately creative and innovative human family. In your work in the essay collection which you edited, Aquamarine Blue 5 Personal Stories of College Students with Autism, you highlight the misconception that individuals on the autism spectrum may be seen as evolutionary dead ends. Your writing, I'm going to quote you here, the evidence provided by the essays suggests that high-functioning people with autism actually have a great deal to contribute to our success as a species. Indeed, persons functioning on the higher end of the autistic spectrum may contribute to revolutionary developments within their fields and propel humanity forward in key ways. For example, many studies have linked eccentricity, unusual focusing capabilities, speech oddities, impulsiveness, unpretentiousness, arrogance and sociability, insatiable curiosity, and a disregard for standard ways of behaving and thinking, with intelligence, creativity, and divergent problem solving. Reflecting on this, I'm curious to know what you consider the greatest advantage of being on the spectrum, or what aspect of viewing the world differently has had the most profound effect on your life.
Right. Well, I'll probably have to take this in parts because it's such a complex subject. First of all, I regret that I ever thought in terms of hierarchy, higher functioning, lower functioning. I mean, that book was written at the end of the 90s. And so a lot of my thinking is out of date and incorporates ideas that I hope that I have kept up with and even generated in my own work. So when I used to do lectures, people would laugh at me because I'd say, one autistic person in 1,000, it's an anomaly. 1 in 500, you might argue, is an epidemic. But 1 in 62 is now, I realize people don't always agree. But 1 in 62 is an evolutionary trend. And because I don't think hierarchically anymore, I don't see this as some kind of superior species emerging that's going to supplant humankind. I don't think it has to be like that. I think I'm sufficiently different from humanity that I probably am something else. I don't think of myself as human. But steadily throughout humanity's history, sensitive people who think differently have been born at a pretty steady rate in order to move things forward, in order to see information and synthesize it differently. And now, obviously, the Earth, the planet, the animals, everyone needs that more than ever. And so I think that people who are highly sensitive are being generated for that purpose at a faster rate than they have been in the past.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because I did actually want to ask you. I wanted to ask you if you know what's the percentage of people in academia that are on the spectrum, and you have. Um, yeah, so I think that is very important. And I'm happy that you mentioned that at the very beginning of our conversation. It gives a bit of an overview on just how common it is and how it is becoming more and more so. Um, Also, just for our listeners' clarity, I wanted to discuss with you at the very beginning of this conversation some common diagnostic stereotypes associated with autism and contrast them with the actual realities that individuals on the spectrum experience. For instance, Michelle, one of the authors of the essays, was initially misdiagnosed with anorexia nervosa, which highlights how easily autism or any neurodivergence really can be misdiagnosed and how much it is misunderstood. Could you elaborate on your insights regarding the extensive range of symptoms that individuals on the spectrum may experience, and why is it so difficult sometimes to diagnose autism?
Right. Well, I think what we have here is just an inadequate paradigm. In modern hierarchical thinking, there's an obsession with compartmentalizing things that doesn't really reflect the nature of reality. Neuroexpansiveness, expansiveness of all kinds, shows up having different, the clusters of behaviors that we exhibit when we are neuroexpansive can be assessed as symptoms and focused on, unfortunately, more than the fact that we are expanding into a holographic world. We experience the world holographically. So if you're a part of the environment, that changes what a diagnosis is. The idea of symptoms all starts to fall flat. I've had periods of anorexia in my life because I was part of my environment and my environment was dysfunctional. That's how the pain of that expansion, that expansiveness showed up for me for a brief period of time or several brief periods of time. So as we do the ethnography, it seems like we're leaning more and more toward the idea that we're all expansive, and that's a positive thing. How our coping mechanisms, our reactions to trauma, the demands of our daily lives show up in what might be called symptoms is sometimes just arbitrary.
Hmm. So you argue that we are moving away from all sorts of classifications in a way.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the whole medicalized model of pathology and deficit is at core what I am working and what several people I work with are working to be the norm, the structure of how we look at these things now.
Do you think that the world is moving fast enough?
No, no, I never do. But you know, I've come to appreciate checks and balances because um, again, it's a holographic proposition. I can't be in charge. So I have to look at my feelings through that lens, I guess.
Yeah, embracing that humility of
Yeah.
not always having the absolute control. In the essay collection, you also referred to a point made by Francesca Happ that it is people on the higher end of the autistic spectrum. You're gonna tell me here that you've moved away from that careful way of thinking, but I will ask that question. That people with high to superior intelligence who are most likely, that it's them who are most likely to be able to come even close to passing for normal, to being able to share experiences that many people take for granted, and to cope by utilizing their intellect and highly developed memory skills. It is in these relatively invisible autistic people who, by dint of their intellectual prowess, we are most likely to, it's them who are most likely to find their way into the university system and then to be misunderstood as students who are detriments to the academy's goals, which is producing uniform students who learn well within a particular instructional range, freeing professors to engage in research, which in turn brings the academy revenue and prestige. What a powerful observation, and a topic which continues to reappear in this podcast series. I would like to touch upon the issue of education, since it is also my own area of expertise in a way of reclaiming a once lost love for the world. Your early educational experiences, as depicted in the Songs of the Gorilla Nation, were essentially devoid of empathy and understanding on the part of the teachers. In high school, you made the decision to leave school, a choice somewhat reflecting a common thread woven through all of the essays in the Aquamarine Blue, the pervasive sense of being either misunderstood, ridiculed, or undervalued. Despite this, both your account of meeting with a psychologist for the first time for your evaluation and Michelle's story of being diagnosed with anorexia reveal a shared feeling of being unable to be authentic and honest about experiences that deviate from societal norms. One thing I'd like us to talk about a bit later on is who do you think sets these norms and what's their purpose? But first, I want to ask you, how common is it for people with autism to experience severe loneliness and anxiety resulting from this sort of self-imposed invisibility? And what are the potential consequences of withdrawing into seclusion?
I'd be willing to say 100%,
Hmm.
at least at some point in their lives, that neuroexpansive / autistic people experience crushing loneliness. And I talked before about how sensitive people were born at a fairly steady rate throughout human history. Certainly, that's true in indigenous societies, where they're trained. They are trained to have a purpose. They become part of the living body of a tribe, for example. And we don't have that. We don't have that purpose, and we're actually punished for the gifts we're born with. So I'm sure that shamans, for example, have been lonely through in their own way throughout human history. But that sense of purpose and that sense of respect and position was there to make up for that. And we just don't have that. And it crushes people. It kills parts of them. And I've been talking a lot lately about how what we think of as autistic symptoms, again, are secondary, basically trauma responses.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think even if you have that purpose, that the awareness of perhaps being something greater than just a bag of bones is always going to make you feel lonely at one point in your life, right?
Yes, and this culture, modern cultures around the world, doesn't matter, use the divide and conquer method of keeping control. The meanest, strongest, most violent people determine behavior in modern global society. And that's who sets the rules. They set the rules, and people are afraid and even terrified, sometimes for their very lives. And that's where masking comes from. People focus on masking as a way to be social, as a way to fit in. I don't see it that way. I think it's based on the terror of knowing that if you don't fit in, behave in certain ways, you could be physically or emotionally or spiritually harmed in egregious ways.
So who is it, do you think, that pushes forward these sort of psychotic traits that we feel we should adopt in order to be able to fit in?
Well, again, I guess, I mean, it's the most ruthless, narcissistic people that rise to the top. Um, they seem devoid of empathy. As a primatologist, watching the way that gorillas raise children, it just really underscores how society itself has become pathological. Children don't get what they need. They are not loved in a archetypal primate way that is necessary for healthy functioning. They grow up to be inadequate parents. The cycle continues to be worse and worse. And then you have where we are today.
Mm. Yeah, talking about that, talking about pathological communities, what fascinates me, particularly given your background in anthropology, is our collective understanding of human communities and reluctance to sometimes fully embrace the diversity that is inherent in the natural world. Why do you think we struggle to accept multiple forms of family structures, diverse relationship choices, and varied belief systems? What underlying factors contribute to our resistance to embrace this rich tapestry of human experience? Why do we need the normal as a reference point?
Because we've lost the organic, like we were just talking about, that kind of the way of being raised relationally, so that groups are holographic, a sense of self is holographic, one's own interactions and family and cultural interactions with the natural world are holographic and necessarily dynamic. There's an infinite number of working parts there.
Mhm.
But what we've constructed is some kind of terrible, flimsy sort of house of cards that we call reality. And it's all people have. Like I was saying earlier, the way people are raised with fear and dysfunction and not having their needs met. It's all they have left
Mhm.
is this flimsy structure that, frankly, corporations and advertising and people in power have sort of constructed with these bones that they throw us. And, you know, I'm not alone in thinking it's about to collapse. And so autistic identity, for what it really is important right now more than ever.
Mhm. I'm happy to hear that I'm not alone in thinking it's going to collapse. Um, Your depiction of communication with gorillas resonates to me so much for its purity and authenticity. It's almost transcending the need for verbal language. It is actually transcending the need for verbal language. It's akin to physical language, where the body becomes a powerful tool for expression rather than remaining awkwardly static, as it is the case with most modern languages, maybe other than Italian. Um, was it difficult to be with people having spent so much time with the gorillas? I feel like I already know your answer to this question. And how did you negotiate this newly acquired knowledge of the self, the sense of community and the animal within, with the outside world? Perhaps this may seem like an unconventional question, but how have your experiences with gorillas influenced the way in which you built your own family later on in life?
Right. I think to that, I would say that influence is, I would probably use the word activation. It's about how gorillas activated the primal in me that I had lost, that had been beaten out of me, like
Mm,
like so many autistic people over the years. And it gave me validation to pursue what I already knew was right, what was structurally resonant for me, for life, for family, for work. I mean, there's really no division in
mm,
reality. Uh, I did take my son over to see the gorillas when he was about 7. I don't know if you know, I was banned from the zoo at one point.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because I had referred to gorillas in songs of the gorilla nation as men and women.
Hmm.
And again, this was back at the end of the 90s, and referring to any animal as a person was
Hmm.
not just unconventional, but dangerous, career suicide. You know? um, so they told me I couldn't come back, and I ended up sneaking my son in, and the matriarch gorilla came over and really watched him, like came and sat with us and watched him very carefully. And I knew she was assessing his behavior to determine whether I had done a decent job or not.
Wow.
And she finally kind of softened physically, you could see it. And she glanced over, and then the little gorillas came over to interact with my son. Like she gave them permission, like he was well behaved enough to interact with them.
Yeah.
That was one of the most moving moments of my life.
Wow, that sounds absolutely incredible. And what an incredible, I mean, I suppose that even means much more than another woman at school, another mother at school telling you, Don, you're doing a great job. I mean, what an incredible way to feel appreciated by another species, right?
It meant everything to me. I
Yeah.
mean, compliments or criticisms from
Mm.
human beings, it's hard for me to pin my hopes and dreads on that anymore. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, funny but not funny. It lost its meaning. It lost its meaning when people were consistently cruel. Um, so I do use my animal friends and guides as a better yardstick for the kind of person I am.
Speaking about our modern day world and the digital age, I'd like to ask you this question because I'm curious of your take on it. Um, what do you think about the internet? Do you think that the digital age presents people on the spectrum with fewer challenges? I mean, we can talk now, meet and study and work remotely. Is it important? Is it vital for neurodivergent individuals, especially to have that option, or do you see some problems with that, perhaps?
I really think it is crucial, and I think that's why autistic people invented it. And everybody else has sort of come along for the ride. It's hard for me to be objective too, because I realize that the ethnography project at Yale would be impossible without the internet. There are just so many advantages. I mean, people who aren't comfortable socially, who wouldn't absolutely would not leave their house to attend a meeting somewhere, find it possible and preferable to use the internet to join the ethnography sessions. And I think it's almost, I haven't talked about this or even really explored it very much, but it seems like it's almost just like a starter. It validates us, it brings us together to be able to see versions of our 3D selves, but then it goes somewhere else, somewhere, well, this holographic system that is even more connected than the internet. It's almost like we use it as a ramp to take off on, and then it's not as necessary. It becomes something in the background. Obviously, it's open to abuses. That seems like a whole other set of books. You know, how autistic people, neuroexpansive people use the internet as opposed to how neurotypical or neurotruncated people use the internet.
In the essays, in the essay collection, you also make the argument that autism spectrum disorders can bring significant challenges for both individuals with autism and their loved ones, prompting extensive efforts to uncover its causes in hopes of eradicating the disorder. I feel like you've made it clear throughout your work how advantageous people on the spectrum are and can be to society, if not vital. But then again, societies differ significantly all over the world. Culture, religion, social norms, these can either make it easier or extra difficult for someone who diverges. Reflecting on my own experiences, as a child, I recall grappling with extreme shyness, eccentricity that was pointed out to me by adults, peculiar habits, intense interests in very specific geographical locations, tendencies towards antisocial behaviors, which, now that I think of it, were likely a result of being held to a standard of normalcy that was just unachievable for me, and a strong need for personal space. Leaving home at a relatively young age and becoming financially independent compelled me or forced me to adopt quickly socially acceptable behaviors, particularly as I adjusted to life in a foreign country. Looking back, I realize how many of these traits were shared with my mother, especially when she was younger. And you also talk about that in the Songs of the Gorilla Nation. That very often we share some of these traits with our parents, and that kind of fostered a sense of kinship and understanding between us. We were united in difference in what was back then still a post-Soviet, new-to-market economy, traumatized by the war, far from Berlin type of mentality, Poland. I was lucky to be able to study abroad and become a wildling for a while and discover my identity on my own terms. My mother had to suffer the pushbacks from the immediate family as she was getting into social work and starting a nonprofit. It was just not the way things were being done. I guess this is just a reflection of mine, but the stigma surrounding the neurodivergence has this enslaving effect for people on the spectrum. On one hand, you want to get diagnosed to be able to better understand yourself, and on the other, you don't have to deal with being labeled as crazy, for the lack of a better word, in many cultures and in many societies around the world. And in the post-Soviet countries, alcoholism is already such a big problem. And now that I think of it, alcohol and drugs can very easily be perceived as the easy ways out when you're feeling distraught. So I guess it's just something to reflect on. You emphasize how society often celebrates the uniqueness and the talent of people on the spectrum, and not people on the spectrum, but just talented people in popular culture. Yet the society struggles to accept and accommodate them in real life. With every episode, I find this podcast drifting towards the attempt to understand the human animal for what it is and not for what it thinks it is or wants to be. And so I want to ask you, why do you think in society we find it so difficult to cope with people on the spectrum naturally within the context of your own culture?
I think generally society is addicted to products. It's been set up that way. So they love the product of the genius. And people, I'll laugh at parties, Back when I used to go to parties, people would do the old party chestnut. Who would you be stranded on a deserted island with? And people would say things like Tesla or Einstein. And I think, oh, for God's sake, you don't mean that. You don't mean that. First of all, I would feel sorry for Tesla or Einstein. Because these people, they love the idea of these skills, but the nurturing of those skills not so much. And then we get into this whole other sort of part of the Venn diagram about how people are addicted to inspiration porn. If there is that one person who makes it past all impossibility, the triumph of the spirit or whatever they want to call it, it serves as this token that they rely on. That if you really do try hard, if you really do kind of make your way through the system, it proves that the system isn't that bad.
The myth
So
of
there's
meritocracy. Mm.
yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And then I think a third wheel is the amount of self-loathing that parents who, again, are genetically connected to these phenomena, who most of the time have experienced versions of different, sensitivities themselves and suffered for it as children, adopt a terribly wounded attitude towards supporting their autistic children. They just want it to go away. And yeah, that's so obvious to me to be a reaction to their own childhood trauma.
I'd also like to delve into some common mechanisms that are employed by very sensitive people. I'm not going to use the neurodivergent, neurotypical anymore. To manage stressful situations, hiding behind a pillow, or as in the case of Kiko, putting a bag on its head. Building upon the themes that you've explored in the Songs of the Gorilla Nation, I'm curious, do gorillas exhibit similar coping techniques as very sensitive people? I mean, you've sort of touched upon that in the book. And would you say that they're perhaps more attuned to their natural instincts? And would modern society consider them neurodivergent?
Yes. In fact, I talk a lot about this in relation to my work in animal rights and veganism and so forth, that we have a natural affinity. I mean, we see it all the time. It's almost a trope at this point, how autistic or sensitive people connect with animals, because we are all neuroexpansive minds in commodified or controlled bodies. It's an absolutely inextricable shared experience. And I've stated elsewhere that I feel like if the movement doesn't embrace that part of our shared reality, we're never going to get anywhere, because we are about presenting alternatives and connections and taking responsibility for things in new ways.
Yeah, and that's actually the next question I wanted to ask you. How do you perceive humanity's modern relationship with animals? And are animals bearing the burden of our economic and technological progress? Do you believe the direction we're globally heading in can be justified by the costs incurred? What would you like to see happen?
Well, it seems evident that modern humanity has engaged in I hate to use the word Holocaust because it's singular and has its own reference, but a tidal wave of destruction and killing on a scale that we'll only be able to appreciate in hindsight. That's one of the things that keeps me awake at night, is knowing about the suffering. As a sensitive person with synesthesia and so forth, being present when animals are being killed, or being present when a forest is being mowed down. There's a whole other set of holographic information, shared pain, shared identity, grief, on a scale that I think neurotypical people feel but it never rises up to the point of full consciousness. And what was the second part of that question?
What would you like to see happen?
Right. Well, I think we have to become, and we meaning everyone of any neurotype, we have to become the example we seek in the world, in the universe. For us, on the spectrum, or however you want to put it, I think we have to be careful not to follow the dangers of other movements and prove we can be part of the existing system and ally ourselves with all life and insist that the human systems as they are now change. And like anyone in a movement, I think that requires cultivating impeccable morality. It's something that we don't talk about very often among sensitive or autistic people, but we see it in that devotion to justice, that we know things aren't right and that we have to try to make them right. And not right in a way that you bulldoze someone else's beliefs or anything like that, but an insistence on resonating at a certain moral level that makes it undeniable that it is the better choice for everyone.
It's so difficult sometimes to make that argument in a very logical world, in a world which was based on human exceptionalism and upon which much of our modern science is founded on. And the very notion of morality and ethics, even in academia, sometimes needs to be logical. And so to engage in that conversation with sometimes people that struggle to feel but think a lot instead is truly a challenge. And in the previous episode, I spoke with Helena Pedersen about omnicide, so the killing of everything. She's an educator, and her area of expertise is critical animal pedagogy. So we spoke about animals in general. And I feel like so often this conversation surrounds topics of capitalism and politics and what we can do to deconstruct these. But what you're saying instead is the focus on the self, rather, and the sort of care to be the example, really, however cliche it may sound. And that's just so much more achievable. And I think it doesn't force us to imagine ourselves tackling this giant of a global system. And instead it brings it closer, brings it home. Don, my last question for you is this. Are we all freaks passing as normal? This is an idea that you explored in the Circus of the Souls.
Yes, it's, I think more now than ever, I think that's true. Because each of us is this sort of resonating node of the hologram with no true selfhood. The universe itself is conscious, of course, and it makes sense as an organizing principle from a scientific point of view. There's a reason we avoid it when it's so obvious. And I also wanted to come back just for a second to what you were saying about this. Ties in several things: the way that gorillas move and how we are in the world, and the importance of embodiment as sensory organs of a freaky universe. The universe itself, as a conscious entity, I think, has a similar philosophy to Star Trek. I think it constantly wants to boldly go and explore while also being balanced and respectful and having a sense of the great sacredness of it all. And when we look at it holographically, then yes, the self, how it's difficult to construct, but self as we experience it is part of this entire way that the universe is going to be. We decide every moment what the universe is going to be, what its nature is going to be. Do we want a just, compassionate, moral universe? Then we must be those things because we are the universe in a holographic system. I think that's scientific and I think it's religious. I think we put divisions that don't belong between those things. Because all of the underlying principles are the same. And it's very empowering. And this is another thing, the thread we've been talking about with politics and corporations. They want us to feel powerless. The current power structure relies on the powerlessness of the individual. But once I realized that even if they come for me, I will still stand there as an unapologetically super sensitive person, an environmentalist because I am the environment, a vegan because I am all of the social aware living things on this planet. They will never destroy that. I personally, in my actions as a node on the hologram, can make those decisions. And that's the universe I am, and that's the universe I want to live in.
Yeah, fear is truly the only thing that we can subject ourselves to that has any capacity to limit our potential. It's something that George Carlin used to joke about. He used to say that we shouldn't worry about the universe. It is so infinitely smarter than us. It is going to rectify itself. But I'm curious, do you think violence and cruelty and aggression are also part of universe exploring itself? Do you think it's a way towards achieving this balance? Do you think we need it in order to understand how not to?
I think that the universe has different organs that it exists through. Some of those organs, three-dimensionally, can be quite violent. The way the earth was formed, you might say, was part of the process of a violent organ that is part of the universe, part of the nature of the universe. But on a conscious level, on the universe's conscious level, I don't think so. I don't think violence is necessary. In fact, it's anathema to the universe understanding itself and working in a kind of homeostasis where everything is part of one body. As a martial artist, I think that in certain situations of self-defense, there is nothing wrong with doing what you have to do to defend yourself. We do it internally in our bodies. We do it in society. The trick is to not be the aggressor. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean that, writ large, like war, but to not be the aggressor in subtle situations. Our global society now really rests on casual cruelty. Mm. And not engaging in that is, takes full-time awareness and cultivation. Mm. What we do know from our ancestors is that it's possible to live in that balance amongst violent forces and to keep ourselves.
That also binds to the idea of this collective trauma that you mentioned before, right? I feel like so often we put ourselves in the position of the oppressor simply because we feel weak and we don't know how to begin approaching that collective trauma. Dawn, thank you so much for this conversation. And I invite all of you listening to familiarize yourselves with Dawn's incredible work and perhaps try to be more understanding and compassionate with one another, because wonderful things happen when we open ourselves up to differences.